Hello and welcome to the Beginner's Handbook. I'm Jordan.
I'm Jamie.
And in this episode we're going to be talking about balance in tabletop RPGs. What do we mean by balance?
So this, you can apply it to a lot of different things. Like most people, when you hear about balance, are instantly going to be thinking encounters.
Yeah.
That's the thing that most people will talk about, and there's 90%, 99% of people are going to turn around and say, make sure your encounters are balanced.
Well, I think when you'd suggested this, we don't sit and write scripts or anything like that, but when you'd mentioned wanting to
As
talk
you can
about,
tell.
Yeah, if you wanted to, you mentioned talking about balance, and I thought, do you mean in like game sense? So, but yeah, it's a pretty common probably conception people would have.
Yeah, so, and the thing with balance is that it doesn't need to be balanced if we're talking about encounters, but also when we're talking about, or at least like if I'm talking about balance in RPGs or anything, I'm also talking about, how often you're playing versus how often you're doing other stuff out with the hobby, and that, making sure that this never becomes a chore and it always stays a hobby for you. But before we get into any of that, normally we'll fire a question out. So what's been the most unbalanced encounter you've ever had? It's something I'd like to know. I'd like to know the impossible odds that you defeated or that you were completely crushed by. That's what I think.
Are you talking about balancing a game now? Because I've got a couple.
Well, I was just meaning for everybody out there, but have you got an answer to that question?
I'd say probably my main barbarian guy surviving the campaign to the point to survive. That's been years worth, and I'm sure there's been great efforts.
Not that you're bitter about it or anything, no.
No, I've survived. That's what I mean. I've managed to get through it. You're just bitter because I killed your dude, though. But yeah, that was, I would argue, impossible odds. I think every stop has been pulled out to take that guy out, and God damn, I love Totem Warrior of the Bear for effectively doubling my hit points since level 3. That's so good. But that's mine. There's other games, but D&D wise, I'd say that's probably the big one. So we'd love to hear from yourselves, or maybe even from a GM. What's the most intentionally imbalanced thing that you've made to try and take it? Maybe not like, you're not trying to get TPKs, right? But maybe you're playing a hardcore game, maybe it's a hardcore D&D game, maybe it's a horror game with very limited life, maybe it's something like Morkborg where you literally have 2 or 3 HP, and on a 4 you're dead, like 4 damage, you're dead. Is there something like that that if maybe players have jumped over a bit in the story that they shouldn't have, and they're now in a completely imbalanced fight? Good example, Curse of Strahd. There's a bunch of witches near the beginning of the game, and a lot of people would like to go and see the witches, who at level 1 will absolutely wipe the floor with you. So is there anything that you've either made or you found your players wander into that they survived and you were absolutely shocked? That'd be super interesting, because I've had many, especially because I consistently roll terrible. So even as a GM, I cannot get a hit. It's brutal.
Yeah, and I maybe fire down a poll on Spotify or in the community tab in YouTube and maybe see like the opinion of whoever's watching and listening, whether they think a balanced encounter is important or not.
Yeah. Okay. So
what do you think? Balanced encounter is important or not?
I think a balanced encounter can. Well, it depends. Not really. No, it depends on your game, of course. But speaking about balancing with balancing your games, I think that was quite an interesting. Just that was something that Jamie had brought up. Very just interesting timing for me, because I think I've said before in this that it'll be a couple of years ago now from the time this gets published, but I was running 4 or 5 games a week. Like that was what I was running, and I was playing with you guys. So I mean, most of my week was games, because just the people I was speaking to at the time all wanted to do role-playing games. But because I run game, I was literally running, I would say on average 4 games, but because there were some weeks it was 6, but I was playing 6, not running 6, I suppose. So between 3 and 4 games average was what I was doing in a week probably just running, and the rest was playing. Actually, that's a wee side note correction. But I got to a point where I'm going, I have absolutely no bloody time to do anything else except preparing. Well, not even preparing for games. That's how I managed to learn to improvise, because I had no time to prep either. So, and I reduced that down to doing stuff bi-weekly for games for the most part. The problem with that, because all the games we were doing at the time were all campaigns. I think bi-weekly is good for longer campaigns. It gives people flexibility. But when you've got 3 or 4 other groups that you're doing that for, it then means that it becomes very hard to schedule stuff, and then I end up being super busy in between weeks to try and make up for other stuff that I was not doing. So yes, it's a lot of work, and certainly coming into the 2024, when this is getting recorded, that is, I'm looking at where I'm moving some games, what I'm cancelling, what I'm going to do in bursts with big breaks. I'm looking at all that right now, because balance is something that I have needed to look at a lot over the last couple of years, because as much as I love this hobby, it isn't the most important thing in my life, believe it or not. So yeah, it's just about balancing that. So it's something I'm working on.
Yeah. And again, in previous episode, we talked where we were talking about gremlins and gremlins in your game. Like the point that we end up finishing on when we talk about the longer term campaign and the issues that crept up through that. At that point, the balance was completely gone for me, because at that point it was every week we were playing, so once a week. And it meant that every week when we were turning up, I wasn't looking forward to playing, and it became a chore at that point, basically. So it meant that every week I was feeling that I had to turn up to do it, because it's the middle of a campaign and it's a smaller group, so if I don't go, then that's a bigger chunk of the group away, and so all these different things start tying into it. And then rather than looking forward and turning up and playing and having fun, it meant that 9 times out of 10 it was turning up and it was a slog. Whereas if I'd taken a step back, had a bit of time, given myself a bit of a breather, and then came back, the gremlins would still probably have been there, but they would have been easier to deal with, and they wouldn't have bothered me as much. And then again, it would have been easier to kind of sail through and deal with.
Yeah, that's actually a good point, because one of the things that we are looking at doing, as of time of recording, it seems like we might be on the track to doing it, but who knows, we'll find out in the next few weeks. We'll see. But even with like campaigns like that game that you're talking about there, I mentioned this last time already, but I was in a spot where I was working a lot and stuff, so it was like you're coming to games and it became hard work, and I almost pulled out at one point. I was this close, like, and if anyone's audio only, I'm putting 2 fingers very close together, from just saying to the GM, like, I need to take a break from this, because it's my only night I have free a week, and it has been brutal, quite frankly. Just not anything the GM's doing wrong. It's just, it was a story. It was the NPCs that were problematic. It was some other characters that might have been, well, for me, problematic. So, and I find personally one of the ways around that is actually, well, I think there's a couple of ways of doing it. Like I do bi-weekly games. I found that good when I used to run a weekly Curse of Strahd game. And I think weekly's fine, it works, but if you're like me and you've got potentially at least 2 or 3 games on a week, and even now when I've dropped stuff down, depending on the week, I might have 3 or 4 games in that week, just because of the way stuff is. So it's a lot of games. I think bi-weekly isn't great. Weekly isn't great if you've got so much of your weeknights tied up in weekly games. But I found when I moved my Strahd game, when I was running 3 or 4 games in a week, or up to 5 or 6 if it was up to 5 in a crazy week, I found doing Strahd every 2 weeks worked quite well, because it allowed the players to relax, it allowed me to get a break from it, and usually end up doing stuff in between it anyway, but it really helped balance that a bit. But I think if you're doing shorter burst games, let's say you've got other campaigns on in a week, I almost find that a burst of games is good, and then taking a short break from it, and a wee break It lets everybody reset. It lets people switch off, especially if they've had characters like the Gremlins episode we spoke about, kind of problem characters. It lets you get a bit of space from all of that. And I'd say one of the things that I recommend to a lot of groups, particularly because a lot of the guys, maybe other than my Friday guys, everybody else I know does more than one set of well, maybe our guys don't, but a couple of the other groups, they do have multiple games a week. So one of the things I recommend to folk, especially because there's people in some of those other groups that all want to run games, is I recommend cycling out a bit. So doing a game for like 3 to 6 weeks, I would really not recommend doing more than 6 unless you know it's going to be finished in the next game, and then handing it over to somebody else to try out their game. Maybe it's a one shot, maybe you just want a week break. You can get a wee break, do a cool wee one shot. When just out the break there, we were doing a campaign. Jamie wasn't around for about 4 or 5 weeks, so I recommended like 2 or 3 2 weeks of Morkborg, just to fill in the gap, and then allow us just to take a small break after that, which effectively is the same thing. We had about 5 or 6 games, I think, of Cyberpunk. I moved on to Morkborg for 2 weeks, and I said let's just call it there until whatever, I think this week. So we're kind of taking breaks and allowing people space to relax, not need to prep over it all the time. I think it's a good way to do it, particularly because we've had cases with these year-plus long campaigns where we've then had the GM say, look guys, I'm really sorry, and genuinely being a bit bummed about it, but they're burnt out from running a campaign lasting that long. And the reality is, I don't really care, it's just a game. It's not a big deal just to put a pause on it. And whether you cycle between campaigns or maybe you just take a break every 3 to 6 weeks, a week or 2 off, or you're doing stuff bi-weekly, I think the whole point is just to try and factor in breaks. That's the main kind of thing I've learned from doing all this stuff, because now I'm going to need to rejig some stuff, because at the moment I'm back to back pretty much Monday to Saturdays, but certainly game wise, the best thing I've done was to take bi-weekly, at least as a first step, and then I'm going to be moving into just stopping them entirely or doing short bursts and bigger breaks. Take breaks. It's not worth people in at your table being stressed out, being irritated with characters, or even getting irritated with how you run games. And I mean, the other thing as well, if you kind of look at your life in general, what are the things that are on a schedule, like work, like having to take bins out to get rid of rubbish, all this kind of thing. It tends to be negative stuff that's on a schedule. It tends to be things that become chores that end up being on schedules. Whereas if you look at things that you decide to do, like something gets released at the cinema and you go and you see it, that's not on a schedule. That just happens when it happens, and then you turn up, or whatever it is, a live performance, a concert, whatever, it's things that just happen and you just decide to do it. So the danger is, when it comes to games, that if you fall into a routine of getting a schedule and it's always every Thursday, or whatever it happens to be, that it then throws that out in your life, and it then makes it unbalanced, because it flips it from being something that's fun to something that's not. So breaks, I would say, are important from that point of view, because if you are in a schedule, so that, again, I understand that if you've got a bigger group, getting everybody there at the same time in order to play something or whatever, it's hard to do, and getting a schedule probably solves a lot of those issues. But that's what it does. It can unbalance it from the point of view as it flips it from fun to not. It flips it from exciting to boring, from whatever. So the breaks kind of help to replicate the spontaneity of it by giving you the period where it's not happening to giving you the period where it is. And then it kind of, even from just a basic point of view, it reminds you of when you've not been playing it and you come back, what you enjoy about it and what you've missed. Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of a different idea about it, because I think there's nothing wrong with actually scheduling. I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. I think the difference is when you've got multiple games in a week. Our Thursday guys, we don't. I think our main problem would be when we tend to get fatigued is when we're doing a game that runs way too long in terms of like a longer form campaign. Or whatever. I think I think the main thing is when I talk about, I don't care how your games are scheduled. What's important is that you remain flexible for breaks, pausing, whatever, switching, whatever. Because I know from experience, including our Thursday games, it can turn into what feels like a commitment rather than it just being I'm happy showing up every Thursday, but there were certainly times in the past where I'm kind of like, I've got to show up to this. And the answer, reality is I don't actually. Now, whether or not the other guys in the group would have been, irritated by that or not, I don't know. I don't think they would maybe now, but certainly maybe at the time they might have. But but who cares? That's the thing. That's something you can speak to your GM about.
Yeah.
Because you're right about the breaks. Like, I think regardless, like if I'm running a long form, I've been doing quite a long Tuesday. It's almost been weekly actually. Normally it's bi-weekly, my Tuesday games, but we've been doing a lot of Warhammer. But that's been about 12 roughly weeks we've done, forgetting maybe day after Christmas and stuff, but it's been a blast, and I know that they want to keep going, but I'm putting in a wee break just so that they can get a wee refresher, because I've had some tough times in the game. So as a GM, I'm like, right, we're not doing next week. But yeah, the breaks also been important. That's why I personally like switching games out. Like there's been periods where I've maybe run a game, then Jamie ran one for a couple of weeks, whatever it worked out, and then somebody else ran a game. Our group's maybe not as good at doing that reliably, because I think the concern just generally with that sort of method is that you kind of forget about games. They kind of fall away. But if that happens, it's probably not interesting enough to run long term, which I know from experience with my Monday group who did cycling separately to our Mondays, and it was like, well, my game didn't get any. It kind of fell to the side, and then I said to him, did people maybe not get fatigued with it though if you were running it? And he ran the same game for us, and to be fair, it wasn't actually very good. It was a particular game that was homebrewed to the nth degree, and it wasn't that fun to play. So I suspect he never thought about it, but I said maybe they just get bored of playing the game, maybe they wanted to try something new. And he was like, yeah, you're right. And then he ended up running a new campaign that was way better. So yeah, anyway, the breaks are good. That's all.
And again, like, I don't disagree with what you're saying. And when I'm saying about like the schedule being part of the problem, I'm also what I'm meaning as well, that if it's the same game week after week after week after week after week, then switching it up with another game again is breaking it. Is getting some, although you go, right, we're going to do this other game for 3-4 weeks, whatever, it's doing something different. It's getting the pause in place, which then means that when you come back to the original game as well, that you've got that there, so you don't need to completely down tools for like 2-3 weeks or whatever and come back, just as long as it doesn't become like the ingrained routine, which then becomes a habit, which then,
what do we do today?
Slowly sleepwalks to going through the motions.
That's a good way to put it. It's when it's maybe more a GM thing, and GMs that are listening might know what I'm talking about, although I've not really said it. But for me, like, I've ran games that I've ran like 2 years straight, and I could have kept going, and the guys wanted to keep doing it, which is why we done it. But that was the same game with a 0 breaks, bar like, whatever, Christmas, whatever, something like very small. It was the same game for over 2 years. It's still ongoing. But one thing I noticed when I was GM was people would talk about how they thought it'd be cool to run it, and they weren't trying to hint that they wanted to try a game or do anything different. They just mentioned that it looks fun and they'd love to try it. So I got to a certain point in my wee story and went, I've not consulted anyone. I'm going to basically enforce somebody else to get a go at running the game, because they all had some awesome ideas that they were asking me. I pretty much know the spoilers for all their games because they kept asking me if it was a good idea, unless I was pulling a fast one on me, but we'll see. But I decided when I started to hear some of that conversation, they might not have been wanting to change game, but for me it felt this is a good time to take a pause. So even though that was something that there was no indication that we should have took a break from the main campaign, that was definitely something that I think, even as a GM, if you're in that organisation or facilitating seat, you can align it in such a way that it doesn't become a chore ever. Because if we continued that campaign and we had the same 7 or 8 fights, let's say, in a row that were all difficult, then that's when it becomes a slog. That again, I think, becomes a GM. It becoming stale can really become, it's more a GM problem, I would say, because it's their games that are not as engaging. But as players, you could be telling a GM that, and as a GM, you could be trying to judge it at the table. But again, that's why I like cycling. Though it removes me needing to keep a kind of ear to the ground about that, and I can just allow people to try it. I more often than getting told I'd like to try something different, I'm more told, when can we play your game again? Because I keep making big breaks. My bad. But it's just the way the scheduling works for the guys. But so yeah, totally. That's the way to maybe try and avoid it getting stale, and whether it's cycling or just enforcing a break every so often, or just giving people almost like a comfort break. Like, you've done 6 weeks of this, let's just skip next week. You know, you don't even need to wait for the signs. I think that's almost a way to get ahead of it becoming stale.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, if you're good at reading the room, you'll know the right time to hit pause.
And it's easier to do that in person. That's what I've noticed, though. Because certainly the long game on our Thursday nights, it's always been online, even though we've been able, well, other than very early days. But even though we've got the chance to do it in person, we don't, pretty much. But it's way harder to judge that, especially at the end of a night. If you've had a bad night, you're kind of like, cool, thanks, see you later, and you're off. You know, you're not trying to sit and be like, well, this is what I thought, here's my feedback. You don't do any of that nonsense. Whereas if you're in person, you can say, I like that button. It takes, 5 seconds, and somebody could understand what you mean. Whereas if you text that, it might take you longer, but the chances are they'll read it wrong. You know, depending on how they feel, they might read it in a bad. So it's harder. Whereas with that stuff in person, with me, it's a lot easier in person.
Yeah, and even as well, like, I'm assuming that most people out there have tried a virtual tabletop, or at the very least they've had some form of experience of using, like, you know, FaceTime or whatever.
Yeah.
And if you've ever done that with a larger group, then you know you need to be pretty disciplined when it comes to talking and listening. Otherwise, it just turns into chaos, and it literally just descends into a rabble. So when you're at a table and you're physically there in person, it's a lot easier to have a chat with somebody next to you whilst there's a main conversation as part of the game going on. It's also a lot easier if there's a lull in that conversation to turn around and go, you know, that was really good, before you move on to the next bit. Or even, again, just reading the room, it's a lot easier to do in person. And again, I suppose it's that kind of thing, like, you know, if you put on music versus actually being at a concert, you go, well, whoever's there playing could play everything note for note the way that they've done in the pre-recorded version, but because they're there and it's live and there's the audience there, there's just a different atmosphere. There's just something different that happens that you can't really explain. It's just there's that kind of energy, if you like, there. And again, to me, it's the same at tables. You know, when you're actually physically there, there's a different energy from when it's all everybody digitized on the screen.
Yeah, and that even applies, though, that whole thing about easier in person and online, even with things like trying to wrap a game up on time. God, I cannot tell you how many games I'm sitting going, when the hell is this going to finish? This was supposed to finish 45 minutes ago, and I've been trapped to 2 a.m. with some games. Even one of the weekday games, there was one that went on to 1:30, and I'm like, God damn, man, this is hard work. Whereas in person, it's a lot easier to actually just be like, you can just say to the guy, like, 2 minutes, and whisper in their ear. Whereas even our Thursday games, I've not had to do it recently, but I usually feel like I'm somebody going, I need to go. Like, I'm sending me private messages, which is just kind of awkward because then they might not see it, and then you've kind of got to text them as well, and it's like, oh God, now it looks like I'm moaning about it. Even though you're not, you're just like, I need to go. Yeah. So yeah, I think the main thing I would just say about balance is, I mean, if you're in a GM seat or you're facilitating it, just even if it's online, like, you can always touch base with folk, how you finding it, whatever, and you can see what people are saying. But I would definitely just every so often, just plan in a little break every so often. It doesn't matter if it's a weekly game or if it maybe suits your players better to do it bi-weekly, do it like that, or just do wee bursts with big breaks, whatever it is. But just make sure that you're trying to read that room a bit. Just if you're running it, it's harder. If your story is part of the problem, it's making it hard to come to a game, and maybe it's like people are busy and they're finding it hard to balance the time. They then will want to come to your game if it's stale. So you can always ask people what they think about it, I would say. And if you're a player that's in that spot, because I've been in that spot of being like, I'm not got the time for this, or even if you do, but you're so busy that you kind of don't really want to make the time for it, you'd rather do something else. Much better to speak to whoever's running your game about it. That's it. Because that could have solved my issues, and it just so happened that my contract started finished when I was working those 80-hour weeks. I think within the month after, when I was literally very close to leaving, and then it opened up so much more time. I actually get to relax for about a month before I was back to something else. But at least it was like it was stuff I was wanting to work on. It wasn't it wasn't a contracted job or anything. So, and that could have helped the GM. He could have just said, let's take a break until you're ready, which would have been way better. So that's what I recommend, that's all.
Yeah, and again, if you are the person who, like, you've got your group and they want to play once a week, but, you know, once every 2 weeks is more what's going to suit you, then, you know, don't be afraid and don't sit and force yourself to turn up, because, again, you'll burn out and you'll lose that balance between what you want to do and what you feel that you need to do. So
exactly.
Again, just if you feel that you need more time or whatever, discuss it between the group, the GM, whatever. If there's somebody in the group that you're closer to, that you know more, maybe talk to them about it to then get them to kind of let the rest of the group know. If you're a shyer person or whatever, find a solution, but don't be afraid to step back and to give yourself that time.
Yeah, it's better to speak your mind and feel forced into it, because sure, you'll probably be alright doing it, but it will get to that month, 2 months, a year, 2 years, and then you'll just want to stop the hobby entirely. I know people that's happened to. So I mean, what I tend to offer, bi-weekly is actually kind of, at least just because I guess I've got so many bi-weekly games at the moment, I find it kind of awkward, because all your off weeks end up becoming on weeks for different things. It's a bit of a nightmare. But if I'm setting something up for folk, and I know it's only going to be a few games, but we can't do every week, I'll usually just suggest bi-weekly with the option of doing it in between. If people are free, and that can close a game off sooner if people are available. But I mean, a good example is one of the guys I play with on Tuesdays or Wednesdays, or Mondays to Wednesdays, depending on how all my stuff falls together. I'll be able to play a game with them, but they've never said we're doing it weekly. They just, what the guy does is says, is anyone free this week? That's all he does, and it allows for so much more flexibility, and that's actually been super good for me, who's a bit kind of fatigued with having regiments all the time when it comes to games and stuff. So you just see what works for you. If it's just a case where you just ask everybody next week, you know, you do a game on the Thursday and you say to the Monday, what time we're good for this week, boys, if any, and you just do it from there. There's nothing wrong with having 3 week breaks or 3 week off time because nobody can make it. That's okay. It's better for them to show up when they're able to than to have to feel like they have to do it. And even our guys that are weekly on Friday, I tell them if people can't make it, then we'll do something different. It's not a big deal. I'm more than happy to cancel a game if people are tired. And it's flexible. So that's an important one too, being flexible. But yeah, I think that's everything I've got to say on balance.
Yeah, pretty much.
Cool.
And the thing with balance as well is that if you want a good game, then getting a good group. But how do you keep a good group? Well, you need everybody to be happy, and you don't need anybody turning up and being burnt out or fatigued or whatever. And ultimately, how do you do that? Making sure everybody's get balance across the board so that they're not doing too much, or they don't feel like they're... And again, with balance as well, something we haven't really talked about is if that you feel like you're always turning up as a player and you're not getting a chance to show off your creativity or whatever, then don't be afraid to, stick your hand up and volunteer to run games, or, whatever it is that you feel the need to do.
I was thinking about that.
Balance isn't just about, when you turn up and when you don't turn up. That's, it applies to everything.
Yeah, so that's something I think I'd like to talk about in a different episode, but that's the important one, being able to, as a GM, because I've seen a lot of GMs in the 5 or 6 years I've been doing this. I've seen a lot of guys who get very possessive as a GM, and they might not be doing it badly, like intentionally, but it sucks the fun for me as well. There's games I like to play in currently because everybody's wrapped up in campaigns that I don't tend to run. I do family games, and we often try different wee games here and there, or a family member runs something or whatever. It's usually the most fun I have in a week generally is one of those games, or the Friday ones where we are trying different games out, and I'm encouraging people who are excited to do games the chance to run a game. And it's fun. Not all the games are good, but it doesn't matter because it's only bad for one game, and then we're moving on to something else probably. So yeah, just if you feel like you want to jump into the GM's creative seat, then say it, and the GM should be trying to facilitate that as well, because they're not the ruler of the table. I suppose technically during the game they are, but as an actual group of probably adults, they should be allowing you to do stuff like that. Now, if you're all in your early teens or something, fair enough, you sort that out the way you sort it out, probably shouting at each other or whatever. But yeah, certainly with the groups I cycle with, it sounds like a menstrual thing. The groups that I jump between different games with, it's definitely a lot better, and it's a lot more engaging for at least the players. They've loved. There's so many people brought into the hobby because of it. So. Cool. Alrighty. I think that's everything from us about balance and tabletop games. So what I'll just do, hand it over to you for the socials.
Yeah, so if you want to answer any of the questions we fired at you at the start, then there's the comments underneath. If you're watching or listening on YouTube, there will be a question or a poll on Spotify. There's Facebook, there's X, there's Instagram, there's Discord, and that's everywhere we are, isn't it?
Yep, I think it is. Just about. If not, it'll be in the description. So of YouTube and Spotify. So
there'll be something somewhere.
Or any other podcast platform we're on. So we're on all of them. But cool.
Quite.
So yes, well, thanks again for everybody that's listening and or watching. And it's going to be a bye from me.
And me as well.